Well, welcome everybody to the Spring 2021 Distinguished Lecture Series for the College of Business Administration. This lecture is on remote work, pain or gain, and it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Phyllis Creek. Phyllis, if you'd turn your camera on and join me, that'd be fantastic. And just like that, from Las Vegas is Phyllis Creek. So Phyllis is now retired and was the managing director at Deloitte, and in charge, at least most recently, of leading the expatriate process for Deloitte. We'll get more into her background because it's fantastic, and she's a great expert on the topic that we'll talk about today. We'll get more into that in a second. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm gonna have my email up through this, and you can send questions by clicking on the little chat bubble in the lower right-hand corner of the webcast. That email should be sent to me, and if there's time, which I hope there will be, about 20 minutes left or so, I'll ask Phyllis some of the questions that you might have. But before then, we're sort of going to do this as a conversation where we talk back and forth about some of these issues that that her and I have been talking about for a little while now. So Phyllis, let me first ask you just to sort of share with everybody else your background, sort of how you came to be an expert on sort of virtual teams and manage your career virtually.
Yeah, I started out really managing people who work remotely from a HR perspective. I worked for a company called Deloitte the first time, and they had 24 employees like scattered around. And I was the HR leader, and I needed to figure out a way how to engage these very remote employees of the team. Fast forward to 2008, I took a role with Deloitte managing their global mobility organization, which was really literally global. So I have 66 employees. We used to push 10,000 people in and out of the US every year, all over to 37 different countries. And so not only were my employees remote, and I was a remote leader, I'm a remote employee, and I had remote clients. So it was an environment for 11 years that I, most of the time, never met half the people that I actually either led or interacted with, or I supported from an expat perspective. And so it gained some really unique insights, working remotely, leading remotely, and trying to deal even with crisis situations remotely. I had to remove 78 people out of Japan because of a tsunami and earthquake and nuclear event remotely. So you learn some really fast skills, and all of a sudden you realize that you can get everything done you do in the office remotely as well.
You know, one of the reasons I wanted you to give this talk, the things I've been hearing about from the students for a while now is that they're tired of this online learning. This isn't they want to be in class listening. This isn't how they viewed life. And I want them to understand sort of the skills that they learn are actually skills that will be used in the future workplace. But also, even if the pandemic wouldn't have happened, the trends were already sort of occurring, right? As you said, your career has been for quite some time virtual. So can you talk a little bit about sort of that transition, and then how maybe the pandemic has sort of sped it up, and then specifically sort of how these skills that students are learning in the classroom now, because you're teaching right now for us, thank you, how these skills that students are learning are actually going to be used right away in the workplace.
They really will. You know, prior to the pandemic, working remotely was almost a benefit that was provided to some kind of specific type of workers. I fell into it because of working globally. It didn't matter where I was. I was going to be on the phone with China at 10 at night. I'd rather do it at home than in an office. But there's a group called Owl Labs, I can say that. And they study and do surveys on remote work. And in 2019, they said about 30% of the workforce full-time was remote. Fast forward to 2020, we now have over 70% of our workforce is actually working full-time. Obviously not our essential workers, but are working remotely. This pandemic has proved to employers that their employees can be just as productive, if not more productive, working remotely. They can save on real estate space. Employees can save almost $500 a month on commuting costs. There's so much that you can do remotely. And so every time there's a catastrophic event in the world, it kind of catapults different technologies. So really quickly, you think back to the pandemic in 1918, the flu. Telephones weren't used that much in homes. But by the end of that flu, it was, because it was a way of communicating. 9/11 was actually the first big push for remote working, because obviously many businesses in New York were destroyed, and they had to find a way to keep the business running. And now this pandemic, not only have we now technology for remote working, but also higher use of AI, because artificial intelligence is now working in the background, helping us keep our operations working versus people sitting there touching buttons. So we've moved in what, a year, now 12 months, what probably would have taken 10 years. And our labs continues to do the surveys, as does Gallup. We've done, PwC has done some, McKinsey's done some. People are really happy working remotely. And it's a unique opportunity, but I don't think it's going to go away. I think we're going to continue to see this, maybe more hybrids, but we're going to continue to see it in the future.
So, some of the questions that sort of come to mind right away are for students. How did you get into this, and sort of how did you sort of learn to do this well? And what sort of suggestions might you have for students that are just getting into the workforce and looking at remote work or possibly remote work?
So when I first started doing things from home, we did more phone work versus video. And so my significant other swore to everyone that I had a telemarketing job, because I always sat around with my headset on and I was on a phone all day long on my computer, but we didn't use a lot of video. It wasn't as used. And as videos have come into play and all the computers now have cameras on them, it morphed into an ability to collaborate differently than just being on a conference call. It's a little bit easier than only hearing the voice, being able to see the faces. And so when I first started working remotely, I was doing it 3 days a week. And I had a young lady who was coming from Milwaukee and making a trip from the Milwaukee office to the Chicago office. And I was driving or taking train an hour and a half one way each day. And so little by little, we decided that we didn't need to go into an office to be on the phone together. We could actually work remotely. And so it was less of an ask. It was more of a necessity of being able to use as much time as we could working in what we were assigned to do versus the commuting back and forth. And so I think students, and actually any employer or employee, needs to step back and think to themselves, do I want to spend an hour in the car, or do I want to spend an hour working so that we can work, be more productive? And so I think it's an ease of understanding what your needs are and figuring out it. Now, in classrooms right now, you have such a wonderful opportunity to practice this, right? Everyone gets tired of the Zoom, and they get tired of listening to lectures online. And I'm sure my students are watching now, rolling their eyes. But in reality, this is the type of work you're going to be doing. What we end up doing is in the work environment, I would get a PowerPoint or a white paper to read, right, before my meeting. I would read it, absorb it, mark it all up so I knew what questions to ask. And then I get on a Zoom call or an audio call and we start talking about the material. That's not any different than the way our classes are moving right now. It's the same skill set that our business leaders are going to be looking for. And so I keep telling the students, this is a resume building time for you to be able to solidify that you can do this successfully, be self-reliant and self-motivated. You can absorb material, all those things that you're going to need to do in the workforce, you're learning how to do now.
Excellent. So what are some of the suggestions? I know you've talked to your students about habits. Can you give us just some nuts and bolts of what it takes to sort of work remotely effectively?
I call it habits. So the first one I always tell people is get dressed. Get dressed. Don't sit in your jammies. Don't sit in your I call it cleaning your garage clothes. You need to get up and feel like you're going to work. And the way to do that is to get dressed. My team used to laugh at me because I was always video ready. You could at any moment say, let's have a video call, and Phyllis would be ready because she got dressed this morning. And so it's a interesting piece, but even watching students in class, they're lying in bed and they're kind of leaning back, and it's like, no, that's not keeping yourself engaged. One of the things that I did most recently is I bought myself a standing desk. And I didn't realize it until I started teaching this way, that I'm more animated standing than when I'm seated. Mm-hmm. And the energy I can bring to the classroom is so much more because, as you can tell, I'm an animated person anyway, but you feel the energy differently than if I'm just slouching in a chair. The other thing that I always do, and I did it when I was working, is I have a process of getting myself opened up for the day. So I open my office up. I thankfully have a separate space I can use, but not everybody does. And so I was listening to an audible.com podcast, and it was talking about this lady who carries around this little plant with her and her computer. And wherever she's going to work for the day, she opens her computer up and she puts that little plant next to her. It's her visual cue that she's working today. And so if she's at Starbucks, if she's at her coffee table, if she's at her dining room table, it's that little plant that tells her this is work time. And so I recommend creating an environment like that. Use the same coffee cup. If you're sitting at a coffee table or your dining room table, throw a sheet or something over it to give you a different cue that today is work and I'm not going to be just talking to friends on my computer today. And then remove all those visual cues or distractions that are around you. If you've got a load of laundry that you know has to get done, and if you can continue to see it when you're supposed to be working, your mind's going to be working. Mind's going to be looking at that laundry and not what you're supposed to be doing. So I'm very habitual. I make sure I open and close my office up every day. Everything gets cleaned up, put away. So one of the biggest issues about working at home is that work is always with you. It's always with you. And that's a downside. It's the biggest complaint I heard from employees. And so we used to work with them figuring out a way to close the day up so that it's all done and with, so that they can walk out their office door and be done with it for the day. Mm-hmm. So I recommend students do the same thing. Get ready for class, get out of bed, get dressed, turn on your Zoom, turn it on, the video. Don't sit behind the black screen because you're not participating then.
Mm-hmm. Great. Just to take a slight sort of tangent here, one of the other things I've heard from students is that that they have to teach themselves, and that this online learning is a bunch of reading, and they're not going to lectures, and they're having to do discussions online and other things. And it struck me that this is what corporate training has been like for a long time now. And that any education that the students would have sort of post their undergraduate degree through some sort of company is going to look like that, right? Sort of online. And so we're training them and giving them the skills to do that well, to learn on their own. But so I'm wondering both what you think about the future of sort of corporate training, because I know I've been in HR and done that as well. And then how a student should be thinking about managing their own sort of future education within a company. Should they sit back and wait for the company to tell them they have to do X, Y, or Z training, or what should they be doing to manage their career?
Yeah, most companies are doing what they call micro trainings right now, which is little 10 or 15 minute snippets for skill development. And you're doing it all online, self-learning. You may attend a webinar class where you have a lecture, but it's materials that have been sent to you before time. You're going to absorb it, and then they're going to apply what you've read in the webinar itself. I can't tell you how many online courses I've taken throughout my career. It's just easier than trying to get enough space all the time to put people in a building. It's also better for corporations because you can train them continuously versus having it an annual event. And so now Deloitte is one of those companies that we have something called DU. So we call it Deloitte University. It's in Texas. But those are really what we call large trainings for like new manager training or new senior manager training. But most of your training is done, you get a little link sent to you and say, this training is mandatory, or we have a catalog that you can proactively go out. So right before I retired, I was doing some training on looking at the changes in time block and Bitcoin. And so kind of educating myself by going out and looking in the catalog and pulling up some courses that I thought would be helpful for what I was working on at that particular time. And so most companies, especially your large multinationals, are going to have things like that. And so waiting for, if I'm in a new hire into a new company, waiting for my training versus seeking it out, you're going to gain more experience. You're going to make a name for yourself faster if you are seeking out activities, and as well as not just in the company. Listen to your podcasts, looking for things that you can do. I am certified in many different things. My company never required it. I did it because I felt it would help me develop my career and enable me to take on more and more, which is exactly what happened. So it's a very self-reliant world out there right now. It's also a lot of freedom though, TJ. You get to set your own career path. You get to decide what you like and what you don't like, and things you're not good at, and most of us know when we're not good at something, you can focus on it yourself versus having your manager tell you that you're not very good at proofing and you need to go take a grammar course. So there's different things that you can do that can make your career and allow you to find your own path. And I'm big on finding your own path, because I think if you wait for people to give it to you, you're going to be on the wrong path.
That's great. So I feel like this conversation can go for 6 hours. So I'm sorry if I'm bouncing all over the place, but there's like so many great things there. So, you just got done talking about, and I want you to put your sort of HR hat on. You said people can find their own path. And what I hear then is sort of employees then could be more engaged and sort of happier. So what does sort of this autonomy that students are going to get? Because I think some of them might fear the autonomy, but as an employer that have a lot of employees, they because I'm thinking about the university here, we're just like any other business. We've gone through this dramatic change. We probably have to change what we do. But so I want to sort of hear what your thoughts are in terms of how employee engagement changes with the ability to sort of take charge over your work and have more autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends in if it's an all remote environment or hybrid environment. I think there's some slight differences. So I'll do all remote for a minute. I think that you need to find your social system differently in an all remote environment. So I was talking that we have an app at Deloitte called Magnet. And what that Magnet app is for all of us remote workers that aren't assigned to an office. When I go into an office, I kind of log in, and this app tells me who else is in that office that's in my work sphere. So I know how to stop by and say hello to someone. I could see turning this app into, I'm a remote worker, and by the way, here's everybody that lives in your neighborhood, or here's everyone that lives in your city. Start a bowling league up, or a baseball, softball league, go for cocktails, happy hour. You can create clusters of remote employees that can create that corporate culture for you and still have that socialization. If I'm in a hybrid environment, you need to try to connect yourself, if I'm a remote worker, with someone who is more of an in-office worker, and build that relationship, because they can give you the buzz of what's going on in the office, which probably isn't going to be as much anymore since you're not going to have your offices full. And then the remote employee can share with the in-office person what's going on from your perspective. And having that, I call them peer advisors, or that connection. For me, it was my admin. My administrative assistant worked full-time in the office. And so I rarely saw her. I mean, for the 11 years I worked with her, I probably saw her maybe 20 times. And so we did everything matter of fact, I just had a call with her the other day. She called to connect with me, and we did a Zoom call. And so it was building a relationship with her that even after I've been retired for over a year now, which is scary for me to say, I'm still making connections with people that I used to work with only remotely. So I do think that you have to really set that, what do I want out of the job? What do I want out of the environment? And not feel like the remote work is the pandemic all over again. Remote work in a pandemic is different than remote work when everything is open back up again. I can go to the movie theaters. I can walk to dinner. I walked to dinner last night, actually. You can do things differently so right now everyone's feeling like this is what my world is going to be when we work remotely, and it's really not. This is a hyper situation. So I think students need to really think about what they want. Their career is so open right now. Companies are going to look for the skills they need, not how close you are. You drivable distance. This resume I won't look at because they're in Wisconsin and this job is in San Francisco. Well, guess what? They're going to look at the person in Wisconsin now because they have the skill set they need, and you don't have to be where you work. You get to live in your climate. I'm in Vegas for a reason. You get to live in your climate. You get to manage your career the way you want. You get to work for small or large companies. You can be a gig worker. You have so many more opportunities. You just need to decide which one you want.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, data already that housing prices in some of these areas where people want to live have gone up a bunch. In San Francisco, they've dropped a bunch because, of course, that's very, expensive to live there, and it's a very dense area, and the people are sort of are leaving. It does seem like a lot of companies are, there are a few well-known companies, Facebook, Twitter, have announced that you can, I guess, permanently live remotely and then telecommute permanently. But then there are a lot of companies, and I mean a lot, that you wouldn't have thought of. Ford Motor Company, Target, lots of companies like that have said that some of their staff is going to be hybrid permanently. Like obviously on the manufacturing plant, if you're turning a screw, you have to physically be there to turn the screw. But most of the sort of other workers that aren't necessarily in that type of a role can work remotely or virtually for some time. And so it's this hybrid environment that sounds like it's going to be really, accelerated coming out of the pandemic. So that creates lots of questions that I have. So one is, I'm not working remotely. I'm in my office right now at the moment, but we're communicating virtually. But I imagine a time when, there's going to be 4 of us that are physically here and maybe one person can't make the meeting. So what do you think the skills are going to be, and how is it going to look to run a effective hybrid meeting in the future? Because that's the one skill we haven't acquired in the pandemic.
Yeah, and actually that's probably what my environment was more like when I was working, because I would work with people in our Nashville office. They did a lot of my accounting for my experts. Well, they were an office that had people in it. So when I met with them, I was remote. They were all in a room together. And so I think you need to, in a hybrid environment, meetings need to be a little more structured, because people are talking around the table. It makes it harder for the remote person to actually hear the call, especially if you're not on video, if you're only in audio. So your meetings need to be a little more structured. You need to have everyone prepared. So sending out meeting material early, everyone absorbs it, comes ready to have the conversation, not reading it while they're in the meeting itself. And
let's be honest though, that's just good advice all the time. In-person meetings or otherwise.
Well, it's true. And I think our technology world has even increased that. When I first started working eons ago, that's not how the world worked. You learned your material when you got into the meeting. With everyone having a laptop now and PowerPoint and whatever, it's totally different. You have to be ready for your meetings. And if you're not, it's very obvious. And in the remote world as well, because you can get lost if you are in a hybrid environment. If you want to remain quiet on that call and just listen to everyone else talk, you're going to get lost. Your career is going to get lost because you're not running it. I'll tell a really quick story. So I was doing a presentation to a global committee within the US board for Deloitte. And the topic was mobility, which is what I was doing for the firm. And I was in a hybrid meeting. So I was in a telesuite with people with me and people on a screen. And I was responding and talking to the people who were sitting in front of me and having the camera answering all the questions. And one of the people on the screen asked a question. It startled me so bad. I literally screamed at the top of my lungs, which is not an unusual behavior anyway, for me at least. And it reminded me though, in note to self, when you're in a hybrid environment, you need to monitor both audiences. And it's something that takes skill, because it's very natural for us humans to engage one-on-one with people that are in front of you. In hybrids, you're going to have people who are only on the phone and on video, and you need to make sure you're engaging them as well. And it was a lesson learned. To this day, people will laugh at me. They will say, "Oh, you were in that?" Mm-hmm. Yep, yes, I was. That was me screaming at the top of my lungs because I forgot I had a secondary audience.
So in preparation for this, I've been watching random YouTube videos on remote work. And so it's like CNBC stuff. I think there was a fascinating conversation on CNBC. So I'll just talk about 2 of them real quick. So one is sort of Kevin O'Leary. Those folks that watch Shark Tank might know who he is.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He's sort of like this sort of skeptical curmudgeon all the time. And he's like, this has been the best forced experiment ever. From his perspective, his companies, he's seen 20% increase in productivity. And he's like, why would I ever give that up? Like, I've seen people that had hour commutes both ways. And now what they're doing is they're basically working most of that hour for the company. He's like, why would I make them come back to a physical office that costs me, $20,000 a year for each employee to sort of sit in? And so he's really been a big fan of it. But then the sort of question that was asked of him is, and I think this is what I would ask of you is, I don't know the corporate world the same way you do. You hear stories about, having to be present with your supervisor, right? So being in front of them, and apparently this is a big thing in the corporate world. Like I have to show you I'm smart and an effective employee. And the way I can do that is when you go to the office, I make sure I'm also at the office so you see me. And then, I wait till you leave before I leave. What do you think is going to happen to sort of that side of things? Is there still going to be this in the hybrid world? People are going to figure out what day their boss is going to be in the office and be there at the same time, or?
And yes and no. So I think it's going to be more scheduled team meetings so that we all know we're going to be in the office together. Because I used to do that when I would fly domestically around or even globally. I would let people know where I was going to be. And if they wanted to come in and talk with me face to face or come to lunch, I'd invite people to lunch. So you don't have to come into the office if you don't want to, but if you want to have lunch with me, this is where I'm going to be, and we can have lunch together, and then you can go back to your remote home office. So I do think there are going to be connection points that people can make, and I think it's important for those connections, the same way as of using those clusters to create cluster employees that can do, game night together and bowling and softball. So I do think that you're going to have maybe more quality time with your boss in a remote setting, because you're going to be getting together to do something versus just getting in to see me sit in my seat and work on my computer all day, and me see them through their glass and they're working on their computer all day. And so I think it's about quality of time and not quantity of time that the remote environment is going to set up. When I left Deloitte, I wrote over 300 thank you notes to people that I had worked with in 11 years that I had been doing this. And there were very personalized notes to every single person, some who I never met. But it's about the quality of the time I've spent with them, either on all my calls and the support. And that's what really is going to happen. I think employers aren't going to monitor you, or most of them aren't going to monitor your time at work anymore. They haven't been for a while. If you're an employee who doesn't like to show up, yes, you're going to get monitored, let's be honest. If you're not, doing your work, yes, you're going to get monitored. But in general, what happens is you get assignments, projects, deadlines, and we work through them. Most companies will give you core hours to work, even if you're working remotely, and making sure you're available during those core hours, and then you flex your time the rest of the time. I found working remotely, I could give up Saturdays. I didn't have to work Saturdays anymore because I wasn't traveling 3 hours a day to get to work. I could do my work Monday through Friday and actually have my weekend. So it does change how you do your work, and it also changes how your interaction with your team. But I promoted several teammates who I had only worked remotely with. The woman who took my job is the young lady who commuted from Milwaukee 2 days a week for me, and eventually we stopped doing that. So before I left, she was promoted to managing director and took over my role. I mean, that's the kind of things you can do. Now, people were lucky. If you have a remote leader, they're going to work differently with you than if you have a leader who sits in the office all the time. You're going to have to work with them differently. But having a remote leader and being a remote employee, you guys are on the same playing field. The other thing I think remote does is I think it makes it more of a egalitarian environment. You aren't competing with your colleagues or your boss as much. You're really showing more of what your work can do and the content and quality versus who can get in the boss's office and spend more time with them. And so I think it levels the playing field. I think it can diversify the workforce more. I just think there's a lot of positives if employers actually step back. So talking about La Crosse for a second. So in a remote environment, I wouldn't be able to teach for you guys, right? Because I'm not coming back to Wisconsin. I lived there for 25 years. I'm not living in the weather anymore. And so teaching online gave me an opportunity to give back to where I graduated from, but live in the climate that I want. And so it also opens up for employers to be a bigger world, a bigger pool of applicants to be able to pull what you need and not just who's nearby.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're a great example of someone we never would have been able to, convince to come here. I do think that there's this interesting thing that we face, though. I like to make a joke that what we actually run here at UWL is a residential dating service that bundles some educational services with it. Our students want to be here in person for obvious reasons and enjoy the wonderful weather but the great environment, and sort of to be able to sort of be with their fellow students. That said, professors have often sort of taught in person, and then much of their work is solitary and it can happen sort of by themselves, and sort of had a lot of flexibility. But as we see the rest of the university, there's folks who, they're in contact with students in person, and much of that work still would best be done in person. Whether it be students sort of talking to someone in financial aid or talking to someone in the advising center. But then there's a whole, there's a host of the back office stuff in finance and administration and other places that maybe doesn't have that same interface. But then we have people who have jobs that are split. Maybe 10% of that is really, dealing with the students and the public, and there's a public facing aspect, but 90% is not. And so I'm just curious as to sort of how you think we're going to, or any institution that has that same sort of aspect to it. I mean, Ford Motor Company has people that have to be in person, right? But then people that can be remote. The equity issues that arise from sort of the increased flexibility for some and not for others. So how do you think companies are going to manage that? What do you think the pitfalls are going to be? Where do you think we're going to end up?
Hospital settings are also a really good example.
Oh yeah, right.
All those essential workers that have to be there, but it doesn't mean that your payroll team needs to be. And so there's that balance. I think it's a little bit about the choices we choose for our careers really kind of determines if I'm going to be a knowledge worker, I'm probably more likely going to be able to be remote. If I'm going to be an essential worker, a firefighter, a policeman, a nurse or a doctor, I'm immediately making different decisions about where my career is going to land. And let's face it, remote work is not for everybody. I used to have people come in who were so excited to join my team because it was remote, and they ended up being so unhappy because they just didn't know how to engage remotely. And we had to do a lot of training to teach, especially our younger set that would join us. So I think you need to be very thoughtful about it. I think that it's not necessarily a disparity of having some groups work remotely and others not. I think it's about what their roles are. When I was in HR, I worked in a hospital setting for a while, and I made sure that all 3 shifts always saw me at least once a quarter, which means I worked 24 hours. I'd be walking the halls all night long, because I do think at times that people do need to see the back office, the operations. So I think there's a give and take. I think most companies will have times where they're going to ask people to be on campus or on location, and you need to be able to get there in some form or fashion. I think the university setting is a good example. I call it an HOA. So it's basically a homeowners association where you have people renting apartments or rooms from all of you, and you also have dining facilities and games and all these things that you can do. And people join those types of environments because they want a community. And I think communities are important. Mm-hmm. And I think companies will continue, we do teach a lot right now on cultures. So we are going to create a corporate culture. And that corporate culture needs to include those remote employees and the employees who may work sometimes on campus and sometimes not. But I wouldn't want to see employers bite their nose off and spite their face and say, I can only have people who are local, because you are reducing you're not going to be competitive anymore. You're reducing your talent pool. You're reducing your ability to get the people you need to do the best. So I think long-term, the answer really is more of a hybrid environment for most employers and most roles. There's so many roles out there. My hair cutter can't be remote. Someone's got to come cut my hair, right? And very important role, by the way.
Yeah.
And so there are roles that are just immediately going to be not remote, and that's okay. And I think people who are more comfortable with working live with people will take roles like that, and it's an important environment for them.
Thanks. I am getting some questions. So one of them is just really kind of a more pragmatic question, sort of what online formats are organizations typically using? WebEx, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or something else?
I was going to say everything. So for large meetings at work, we use the WebEx a lot for very large. We used Skype a lot at Deloitte as well. They're now using Zoom. I've been doing some meetings with people at Deloitte. Now they're doing Zoom. Zoom didn't come in big time because they had some security issues with it. But I think now it's really kind of populating a lot in most companies. So getting really skilled in using it will be helpful for students when they begin working, because you're going to most likely be using Zoom, as well as Microsoft Teams, some Google Meets as well. Those are also pretty high.
And I think this is, one of the things we always try to tell students is that while we might have to choose a technology to teach you, we want you to focus on the skills of learning the technology, but know that you might have to adapt to another technology. I just got out of another meeting, which was in Zoom, and then earlier in the day was in a Teams meeting in different groups, used different programs based upon lots of different things, whether you're interfacing with someone outside or it's inside the organization. It seems like we use, the administration here uses Teams for inside stuff, but for outside stuff, we use Zoom. I know all the professors are sort of switched to Zoom pretty quickly because of some flexibility, and all of them have different features, and you really have to sort of use the right tool for the moment, right?
Well, and most employers aren't going to teach you. Most employers are going to give it to you, and that's self-reliance, right? So I did a presentation for the Madison Technical College in May last year, and they were using Teams. And so I downloaded, fussed with it, figured it out, and then I was done. I mean, and Zoom's the same way. We didn't all take a lot of Zoom classes to learn how to use it. Right. It all works about the same way. Right. Sometimes you just need to play with it.
Right. I think that's a good lesson for students, by the way, is I know they get frustrated sometimes with the technology that they can't find things in the same place for different instructors. And I think that's the real world though, right? Is having to adapt to the technology.
It is. And one retirement story is I worked with a PC all of my work life, always had a PC. And I was trying to decide what to do when I retired. And my cousin, who is actually an IT guy for the Madison Technical College, told me to go with a MacBook Pro because it's less updates and easier for someone who is a technology person. And I moved to an Apple, and talk about a technology difference between the two. Learning how to use Zoom versus Microsoft Teams is so much easier than learning how to use an Apple after you've spent how many years using a PC. So it's easier than we think, making the transitions.
Yeah. There's another, I'm going to run the risk of not having fully read this question before I read it to you, but so someone is asking, they read an interesting article about workspaces will change with an increase in remote work, such as the demise of office space, beginning to include conference rooms with rental apartment buildings. How do you see infrastructure changing in the long term in the United States between commuting and living spaces?
Yeah, there was a big push over the last 10 years to consolidate offices and get everyone into a big office tower. Mm-hmm. And then little by little, even when I was still working, many companies started reducing their real estate space, mainly because they want their employees out with clients, especially our knowledge workers. And so little by little, they were reducing office sizes anyway. I mean, I got kicked out of an office. Originally, I had an office in the Chicago office that was mine, but I only used it 2 days a week. And so I got kicked out of it and told I was now a hoteler. I do think more and more companies are going to create environments where you can come and meet as a team, maybe use it for some training, client work, but you're not going to have assigned offices anymore. You're going to be basically checking in, making reservation for a space. And I also think we've moved away from cubes and offices to just kind of large work rooms where you may have some desk space in it to collaborate. So I do think it's going to change how we do work. However, the pandemic has changed some of this as well. Because of these large open rooms where people are stacked next to each other, they're not going to be able to open that way again. They're going to have to revitalize their offices to make them a little safer until the pandemic truly does simmer completely down, which is probably, at least another year away, if not more. And so I think one of the issues that companies are going to have right now is what to do immediately, and then what's the long term. And so I do think we're going to go back to satellite offices. So Deloitte used to have them all over the suburbs in Chicago, and then they closed them all up and pushed everyone into the city. I think satellite offices are coming back. Small and medium-sized businesses are using satellite offices right now. They can rent spaces in these collaborative buildings where people rent space to just gig workers or anyone wants. I have a friend who owns a business in Texas. She closed her offices, and her team basically rents space in a common building together with other employers. And it's actually helped her business because she's making connections that she wouldn't have otherwise made. So I think that we are going to see more satellites, less big tower, and more kind of using them for teaming events versus officing.
Yeah. Just to relate to that, what I was astonished by is, I think Kevin O'Leary said this, or someone else said this, but the average sort of cost per worker of those sort of space in a big office building is $20,000 a year, right? And that shocked me, but I guess it shouldn't have. I never would have thought about it. But what's interesting is that, then the point was sort of made that firms are going to save that money, but they're actually not going to save all of that money. Some of it they'll invest in, the infrastructure for your home, for working at home if you're going to work at home, but also reinvesting in other things for their employees, right? I mean, what we find is it just won't be wasted on that sort of high-rise corporate space like it was before.
Well, exactly. You're going to be able to do better quality in-house training if you really do want to bring people in, let them meet in a more collaborative environment versus just, butts in chairs,
Right.
basically working. And one of the reasons that Deloitte started collapsing the real estate space was just that. They used to do office checks. They used to walk around there and check to see if offices were actually being used. And that's when they came to the realization that so many offices were vacant every day. Why are we using the space? And they are really good. I mean, if I can save $500 a month by not commuting into the city, that's an instant increase for me.
Right.
And then my employer can now invest in more learning for me. It's also an increase. And so I think there's going to be, you're right, they're going to take that money and invest it in their people.
Right. So related to that, the second question this person asked is that they've seen large multinational corporations able to support their workers remotely during the pandemic quite easily. But what about for the small, medium-sized firms that don't have the same capital and resources? How do you perceive them making the shift to remote or this sort of new hybrid?
Yep, and they're thrown into it, right? And so actually, the Owl Labs group I was talking about earlier, they actually were looking at small and medium-sized businesses, and 57% of them said they're going to continue to use a remote work environment after the pandemic because they saw such an increase in their employee engagement and availability. And so I think really what they're going to do is use these satellite offices where you can rent space versus having large businesses. And that way you can use a conference room, you can use telecommuting room. Zoom, doesn't cost a lot, right? As long as you have your meetings at a certain length, anyone can have it for free. So I think small and medium-sized businesses are actually going to capitalize on the improvements that these technology companies made for the multinationals. And now it's small and medium-sized businesses can invest, but they don't have to invest the capital. They used to have a teleconferencing suite. So I really think it's going to really trickle down to all different types of businesses, including a single or two-person business. They all of a sudden have access to Zoom and can meet with their clients all around the world so much easier.
I want to come back to something you said. There's sort of earlier you mentioned that this opens up lots of firms to an increased diversity globally that they probably didn't have otherwise, because they could hire sort of a completely remote worker. And I want to, before I forget, I want to also sort of ask about how that affects these agglomeration effects that we've seen. But let's first focus on the diversity thing. Can you describe a little bit more on how you see this actually increasing diversity?
So if you think about it, our cities are generally very diverse. Our big cities are, but our small and medium-sized cities are not. And if I'm an employer and I'm trying to diversify my workforce and I'm pulling from my local labor market, I'm going to hire what is already living nearby, and it's really not going to diversify my workforce too much. And so if I can expand that 100 miles, you may find a completely different labor market and diversify being able to hire people that you would not have otherwise hired. You also, for some of the small and medium-sized companies, you may have a niche skill you need, and you're trying to convince people to come and live in, pick your small city. I don't want to insult anybody by calling one out. So
you can say La Crosse. We understand where we are in the world.
So you won't have to worry about, does someone want to live there? Because I'm going to be showing more what I can give you in a corporate culture, but you can live where you want to live. And all of a sudden, I have been able to diversify my workforce. Studies show again and again and again that the more diverse your workforce, the better the bottom line. And this is an opportunity for them to step back. We did our class yesterday. We talked about this. One of my students brought in an article about, her name is Devin, brought in an article about IT companies are going to capitalize on this and not just recruit domestically, but they can now recruit globally or use what we call a geocentric recruiting, looking at a region and actually be able to get the skills they need, get more people, be able to work better with time zones. It's a boom for some of these companies that need to work differently or serve clients differently. And so I really think we can diversify our workforce, and not just with people of color, but also just different ways of thinking. People think differently in different states and different countries, and we can be able to pull that all together and create a culture that has been really missing in many companies for a long time.
Yeah. So the next question I want to ask is that this is kind of an econ nerdy question. So for a long time, we've we've talked about agglomeration economies. And so what we mean by that is, as someone moves into Silicon Valley, a firm starts up there, and then you have more firms that are similar. All those engineers are running around together, they're going to the bars together, and then you have sort of this flourishing of ideas and this entrepreneurial spirit. And we see the huge productivity increases, and this is why San Francisco can pay the high wages it pays and have the high costs it has, but it also has some of the highest productivity in the world, right? Same with New York City and some of the other places. But what we've just been describing are things that are going to get people out of those cities and leaving them. Are you at all worried, if you put your macro hat on, are you all worried about sort of the decrease in this entrepreneurial spirit that you see in these places? Or do you think we'll find ways to replicate that in different ways now?
I think it's going to find other ways to replicate it. I also think it gives more people an opportunity to share in that innovation, because I don't necessarily have to be in Silicon Valley to do it.
Right. Okay.
I think it actually gives all of us who are maybe just as bright as those that are living in the Silicon Valley, but we haven't had the opportunity. I think even from a recruiting perspective, companies like Deloitte, we recruit from certain schools because we have large population of offices there. Well, we can reduce that now. We don't have to worry about that. You can actually recruit from an expanding school set, which allows you to diversify. It allows people to give that entrepreneur spirit that they might not have otherwise been able to utilize.
That's great. So I think about that, in terms of diversity, there's other ways historically, like if we think about the traditional, I'll say 8 to 5. I'll say 7:30 to 5 work. And the reason I say 7:30 to 5 is because my children's school starts at 8:10. Right. And so if I had to be somewhere at 7:30 right now, this would be too tough for my family. And so I think that, having this move to virtual, in terms of diversity, there's a lot more people that can be invited into the labor force that maybe previously were found it difficult because of sort of the rigorous timing of it, I guess, for lack of a better word. So, what are your thoughts about that in terms of, literally going out and attracting some of those folks that maybe were out of the labor force for reasons due to sort of that rigid time period or whatever.
Well, and it's true, and the pandemic has hit women the most because they've been backing out of the workforce in order to take care of their children. And so we're hoping that we can encourage them to come back because we have a more flexible remote environment. Schools will be opening up again. That's helpful. Companies will have rule sets about your child it has to be cared for while you're in your office. You can't be trying to do both at the same time. But I do think that it gives people an opportunity to do things differently because you have the flexibility. So I'll give a really quick story.
Yeah.
I have a young lady that I hired. She was an internal transfer into my work group, and I was going to put her on this very large 2-year, 3-year project. And so I was explaining the project. I'm all excited about it. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm really excited about it, but I'm going to have twins." Oh, right then. So we talked about what her plans were, and she really wanted to join the project. She didn't know what would happen after she had the kids, but she really wanted. So we put her on the project. She worked about 4 months before she had to go off. And when she came back, she came to me and said, "Okay, my husband's going to drop the kids off in daycare, but I got to pick them up, and I want to get through traffic. Can I leave the office at 3:30? And my response is, "I don't need to know when you're leaving your office," because she's working remotely. You know your schedule. You know what your needs are. Block it off your calendar so people aren't scheduling time over you. Take the time that you need because I know you're just going to get your work done." So I think that flexibility allows a lot of individuals who are caring for ill parents, who are caring for children, that you need that flexibility to be able to get things done. And we can bring all kinds of new people back into the workforce or into the workforce that haven't been able. We are going to have a talent shortage, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and it's creeping up. And so as these baby boomers are retiring, they are leaving holes. And the only way we're going to be able to actually fill them is to get very unique, very creative in how we actually use the talent pool that's out there.
It's interesting to talk about talent shortage. So this next question is, I think, a great one, and one I was going to try to work in a little bit. But let me just ask it here. So a big part of our advantage in the U.S. as job seekers is literally being located here. You've discussed how this benefits to employers, diversity, cost savings, et cetera. But this will accelerate offshoring of jobs. How are U.S. job seekers with little experience supposed to set themselves apart from people abroad?
Well, I think we set ourselves automatically apart because we actually have the advantage of having U.S. business skills. So when I staff people around the world, one of the things that most of my clients that were in other countries wanted was U.S. people. And so they want U.S. people working on U.S. activities. And granted, some of the stuff is like international tax or U.S. tax. Yeah. But in reality, we in the U.S. are very different than most countries. We train our people more once they're back in the work environment. Schooling, a bit different question. But we actually spend a lot of time. And so the skill sets that we develop are very marketable. And I don't believe that the pandemic or remote work is going to push things more offshoring. If anything, the pandemic has taught us we need a few more things onshore here because of some of the things that happened during the pandemic. But also, at Deloitte, I had 900 employees that were what we call a non-relocation global assignment. They were individuals that were doing global things for Deloitte, but still staying on U.S. soil. I did not have that many non-relocation assignments of non-U people. I didn't hire people in the UK to do US work. I was hiring US people to do UK work sitting in the US. Right. So I think we still have a huge advantage. I think that our companies, there's so many companies here that are headquartered. There's so many companies that are headquartered in other places that have subsidiaries here that want US people. I don't think it's a disadvantage. I think how we respond to this and how employers build corporate cultures, how they build a remote, how they build the collaboration, that will make us marketable. If we do it wrong, then we are going to be offsetting what our employees can actually do for us.
Yeah. I mean, I have to take the economist privilege and speaker privilege to sort of also point out that this is, some of this concern about offshoring or having sort of global competition it's this fear that there's a fixed number of jobs, but you just got done highlighting there's a talent shortage. And so that suggests that there's not a fixed number of jobs out there. And so I'm not worried. I mean, I think what's great about sort of global competition is it in the same way, when you play a tennis match against someone who is really highly skilled, it raises your game, right? In the same way, sort of as we are able to compete with global, the sort of the global talent pool, it will sort of raise all our games. And as you point out, we still have a great advantage in many ways. And some of that will be diminished over time, but not at a cost to us, but at an elevation to the world, frankly, right? So I think it'll improve sort of global productivity. It'll improve all those things. And I think that's the thing about competition, or even sort of thinking about equity in the job, right? If someone else has got the ability to remote work and maybe my job sort of locks me in, I think about the skills I might get to be able to remote work if I want to do that, right? But their ability to remote work doesn't negatively affect my job, right? I can still do my job.
Well, and actually, the companies who start hybrid environments are going to be more flexible with their in-office workers because they know you can work from home or could do some things from home. So this used to be that benefit where, I got a contractor coming over. Can I work from home today? My plumbing isn't working. Can I work from home today? So what's going to happen is companies are going to have these flexible environments where you have remote workers and then you have in-office workers who get to the benefit of working remotely when they need to. They're just not going to do it full time.
Right.
And so it's sort of like when, a lot of different, like the FMLA and all those things laws that we've built that help specific populations. In reality, they help everybody because it's giving us a benefit that we didn't otherwise have until these companies made rule sets for them. So I think that it's not an inequity issue. You're right. It's about the job I hold, but I'm still going to be able to benefit from some of the policies that the firm is allowing other people to do.
Right. Great. So I want to ask, I feel like I apologize. We had a script planned out and I jumped all over the place because I'm so excited to sort of talk to you. Is there anything that I missed that you sort of want to bring up that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think that I would basically implore the students right now to take an opportunity to use the rest of the semester as learning activities. Learn how to use and learn how to chit chat. I open up my classroom so that students can come in without me. They don't sit in a waiting room, right? They all get to come in. And the intent is, not that they use it, but the intent is to learn how to collaborate and chit chat with individuals that you're not going to meet. You are going to need these kinds of skills when you get back out into, I call it the real world, when you get back out into work world, because you have to find a way to interact with people. And this is the time to do it. Practice it. Practice asking questions, using your emojis, being present. It's just, this is the time to do it, not wait until you have your first job and then go, oh Lord, I wish I had listened to Phyllis and TJ, because they're right. I needed those skills and I didn't learn any good things to do. So I just think this is the time to do it.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you have any more last advice. So maybe let's not to end on a negative note, but sort of what have you seen as sort of the big, or what do you anticipate is going to be our big hurdle going forward as we, make these sort of transitions that we should be thinking about in work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the bigger transitions from an employee perspective, or even students becoming employees, is finding that opportunity that gives them the right mix of remote and hybrid, whatever they really want, and making sure that they're getting the training and education they need for that role and being self-reliant and not getting frustrated with it. You can feel very isolated and working remotely. Or even working, by the way, working in an office where majority of the people are remote, you maybe find yourself that you're the only one with the light on in your office, and that can be also very isolating. And so I really think that this is the time to really kind of think about what you need and being self-reliant on how to move forward with it. I think it's an obstacle for employers to decide what that mix is and how to make sure they can create an environment that supports that mix. And if your leaders are all in the office, but all the employees are remote, your leaders aren't going to know, they need to learn how to connect. And vice versa. If your leaders are all remote and your people are in the office, the leaders still need to know how to connect. So I think there's some obstacles that are still out there that companies need to figure out, but I think that they have the time to do it, and you're hoping they're doing it now as they're looking at when and how to open up their offices.
Oh, great. Well, Phyllis, I'm all out of questions in the chat, and like I said, I think I could keep talking to you for 6 hours, but we're sort of up against time here. So I really appreciate your time. I want to thank you for also stepping in and teaching. I think the students have had a tremendous opportunity here to learn from you. And thank you for sort of sharing your knowledge with us today. I hope you will do it again sometime in the future. Maybe come back, 5 years from now, and we'll see how it all went.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's a cycle, but it'll be interesting to see what it looks like. And standing aside and watching it happen, it'll be interesting to see where the students land.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.